Good morning. We're continuing our discussion today on pre-Columbian America. Looking some of the early cultures of the nation, like some old Mesoamerican civilizations, and the early European explorers. Looking at the Hopewellian civilization, the upper Midwest, Cahokia, Mississippian culture came on later. Pueblo culture with the Southwest, and the Incans, the Mayans, the Aztecs, probably the Europeans with Leif Erikson, Christopher Columbus, the Spanish, Ferdinand Magellan, and Fernando Cortez. With Erikson, those are two S's in Scandinavian languages. They don't use apostrophes to indicate possessions. You just put it in the double S. Okay. Now, like a lot of early civilizations around the world, major river valleys became important means for trade, transmitting culture and ideas, and transporting people. These are these superhighways of today. Reliable source of water, a lot of tributaries, so people to sail up. Or drift on rafts up and down these rivers and walk around the banks, and they'll find another settlement here fairly quickly. Like so you see this, the Mesopotamian civilizations, India, China, elsewhere. And you also see it in what will become the United States, particularly with the Mississippi River Valley. Mississippi extending from the Gulf of Mexico up to Minnesota, the Ohio River branching off of it east into Pennsylvania, and the Missouri River branching off west into Montana and the Wyoming of that area. Instead, traveling along the Mississippi River's tributaries and get to most parts of the United States fairly easily. One group came to dominate here around 2000 BC, up to about AD 600. So the group came to be called the Hopewell culture. After the archaeologists later. Main center of operations was in Ohio. These are mound builders. They, like other Native American civilizations, they would routinely build ceremonial mounds for a variety of reasons. Reasons differ from culture to culture. Sometimes it's burial mounds, sometimes it's astronomical calendars. All sorts of different shapes they make out of the soil. Little snake patterns or deer, I don't know. We'll pretend this is deer. But you can see these, especially when you're flying overhead in the region. Sometimes birds. In fact, you go down to Poverty Point, there's kind of this huge bird mound. Not quite sure what it's for, but apparently it seems to line up with the angle of the sun at different times of the year, so it seems to have some kind of calendar purpose. They built these by hand, one load of dirt at a time. Now, that said, Native American civilizations, there's not just one, there are numerous different civilizations. Dozens of languages, dozens of different religions, dozens of different cultures. But with the Hopewell culture, they all seem to have certain things in common. It's primarily because of the spread of ideas from one part of the continental United States to another. It is, somebody has some neat design or neat idea or neat story, they just pass it along into their own culture. Like I say, this network had connections from Montana to New York. And with a lot of these different mound designs, like say these burial mounds, you'd have a lot of houses, basically kind of crude huts by our standards, kind of populating in and around these burial mounds. Of course, it's not so unusual from our society. Go down a few blocks here to the cemetery. What do you see all around it? Houses. It's not all that different. As I imagine, the children in that society try to scare each other with stories about living by the cemetery too. But they'd be making tools in the Ohio River Valley from obsidian and Rocky Mountains, breastplates and ornaments from copper found near Lake Superior. They even had bowls made from seashells from the Atlantic and the Gulf states. They managed to get around fairly well. And going back to our earlier idea that human beings can be very determinable creatures when we want to be. Well, after the decline of the Hopewell civilization, you have a huge city emerges here on the Mississippi called Cahokia. Originated around 600 to 800 AD. From Cahokia, we were able to learn that the bow and arrow was introduced to the Americas around the 8th century. And so this is an important advance for hunting and defense, something that existed in the old world for centuries by this point, but it's something that just by this point just getting around to. At this point, the civilizations of North America really didn't need it much. Also know that corn becomes a major crop around 8800. Corn being brought from trade and contacts in Mexico up north. Now, this whole area here of Cahokia, it's just across the river from St. Louis in Illinois. Some of the remains still there to this day. It's in your East St. Louis and all that. It's a huge site they have there. Go in and visit any time. It becomes a major center of trade between about 1050 and 1250. Of course, that whole region of the country today, we think Iowa, Missouri, Illinois, think a lot of corn being run, but it's something really happened just a little over the last 1,000 years. Brought it to there. Cahokia was a bunch of temples, stone walls, burial mounds. I believe the city itself may have had a population between 30 and 35,000. And larger than El Dorado and Magnolia put together. Almost as many people in that one city as there's in all of Union County. Now it starts declining around 1250 or so. We're not quite sure why. There were some droughts further west that were causing some problems. Indications perhaps some other mound cities similar to Cahokia may have become more important. Occasionally caused by the overworked environment, that is, they have overused the resources they had at their disposal. But the city went into a series of decline, and so very little of it was left by the time the European explorers came several centuries later. Well, after the collapse of the Hopewell culture, sometime around after Cahokia is reaching its height, the Mississippian culture comes along. Probably in the southeastern part of the United States, using mostly Mississippi River again as an avenue of trade, and reaches its height between the 14th and 15th centuries. And just for the arrival of Columbus. It's derived from the Hopewell culture, basically kind of an offshoot of it, but a lot of influence from the Mesoamerican cultures further south into Central America. You can tell that from pottery and farming techniques and so forth. That temple mound design similar to what you see in other areas, but sometimes you also see ritual human sacrifice in some of these societies. Basically, some of these civilizations, they really thought that you needed to sacrifice it to someone to appease the gods. Now, what you see there with ritual human sacrifices, almost always, that comes from a very stratified society, one where there's a distinct class order. So they're not going to sacrifice just anybody. They're usually going to find somebody they don't like, convince them it's great honor, and get rid of them. But societies that are more egalitarian, where everyone's considered more or less equal, you don't see that. This just really just doesn't happen. They see value in other human beings, but these distinct class cultures, you'll see much more willingness to dispose of certain individuals more than others.
What you say?
Yeah.
Didn't they tend to dispose more of the people that had committed a crime in their eyes and stuff like that?
It depended. Sometimes it was because it was a criminal, sometimes a trespasser, an enemy. It just really depended on a lot of different things. So it's kind of hard to generalize why one particular culture decides to do this and another one doesn't. But generally, that class structure is in place. They think that people are disposable.
Yeah, they also, whenever they were at war with somebody, they captured their people and sacrificed them.
Exactly, especially the Aztecs.
Mm-hmm. That was their big thing, was capture and kill.
You have to understand, in societies around the world, religion is a very important thing. It drives people to build great monuments, to achieve great deeds. But understand, people believe very different things, but they may believe something different from someone else, but believe it just as strongly as someone else. For Christians, it is a verified fact that Jesus Christ was the Son of God. He was born of a virgin, crucified, dead, and buried. The third day he rose from the dead. Christians will believe that just as much as the fact they're sitting here in this room right now. And people from these ancient societies believe it just as much that they have to feed human hearts to their sun god, or it's the end of the world. They believe that just as strongly. It's just as impossible to ignore for them. Now, of course, I'm not endorsing that, but just saying this is what they think. But the religions generally closely linked to elements of nature. You'll find in different civilizations, different types of god concepts. Most of them are polytheistic or pantheistic in nature. That is, they might have certain figures they are relating to certain elements of nature, is responsible for it. A harvest god, a fertility god, gods of the weather, and so forth, sun gods. Some are what they called animists, because they believed spirits inhabited inanimate objects, trees, rocks, or animals. They could communicate to them. But again, it just differed very greatly from one culture to the next. The harvest festival ceremonies they practiced were practiced by southeastern tribes even after the general collapse of Mississippi culture well into the 18th century. Then you get the Pueblo culture. They arose around 400 BC, and still exist to this day. Probably in the American Southwest, the Four Corners area, New Mexico, Arizona, Colorado, Utah, that area. Survive this day the Hopi tribes, the Zuni tribes. Interesting thing is they're out here in one of the most arid, most inhospitable parts of the modern United States, but they were farmers. These are farming civilizations. They mastered irrigation in a very arid climate. These are also the famed cliff dweller cultures. Build these adobe structures, sometimes 4 to 5 stories high, perched against rock faces. For the early major civilization cultures of the Pueblo tribe was the Anasazis. That came to dominate the area. What I know about the Anasazi was they had no real class structure. Generally very peaceful, very hospitable. They did not practice human sacrifice as a rule. But throughout sometime in the 13th century, forced their decline. So not a lot of water available, their resources dwindling. And since there was also that drought affecting the Great Plains, a lot of tribes in the Great Plains started moving further south into the southwest, those more populated areas, trying to retrieve food and water, most notably the Navajo and the Apaches, waging bitter wars against the Anasazi. I think the Navajo they end up moving into that area and settling, adopting a lot of cultural traits of the Pueblos, but they are from the Great Plains area originally. Until that, some of the differences in their cultural ideas and language structure. They move into Mexico and Central America, the Mesoamerican societies. Now, between 2000 and 1500 BC indicates their permanent settlements are emerging in Mexico. Or for the United States, because these would have a great deal of influence on cultures in Mexico. They'd also start developing trade with the tribes in the American Southwest, Texas, and into the lower Mississippi River Valley. Very complex, very advanced civilizations. Between about 300 and 900 AD, you have the height of what they call the classical civilizations. Most notable among them was the Mayans. The Mayans, most of their activities based in southern Mexico, the Yucatan Peninsula area, Honduras, down into Guatemala. Like I said, their descendants are still there to this day, still speaking the same Mayan language, still having some Mayan cultural ideas and traditions. But actually, the thing about the Mayans is they became the most mathematically advanced culture on Earth. So in this time period, 4th through the 10th centuries, you cannot find better mathematicians anywhere in the world. And part of that had to do, again, with their basic beliefs. They studied astronomy very closely because they, like several other civilizations around the world at that time, believed that if the motion of the stars in the heavens were messages from their gods, and if they could study these patterns and understand them, they could understand the will of the gods. So they compiled this huge astronomical series of catalogs, noting what stars are where, and they rose and fell certain times of the year. They did this all without telescopes, but still one of the most advanced and thorough catalogs anywhere in the world. And of course, to accomplish all this, they need a lot of mathematical skills. So they became experts at calculating these geometric systems, and like I said, they had the most advanced calendar in the world. The calendar was so accurate, they calculated this without benefit of computers or satellites or anything else. They calculated the value of the solar year to within 20 seconds of its modern accepted value. These huge temple pyramids they built in the jungle, complex cities. They had in their number system the number 0. And the Europeans didn't even have that. So the Romans never developed 0, and Christian civilizations in the Middle Ages wouldn't accept the idea of 0 because theologically they couldn't accept the idea that there was 0 meant nothingness, meant an absence, would imply an absence of God, and they couldn't accept that. God had to be everywhere, so therefore they believed there could not be a lack of anything. But navigation, complex directional calculations, astronomical calculations, even with trade, comes to a point you have to be able to zero things out. And so they had basically it was a system of dots and dashes. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. You can see these in the hieroglyphics to this day. 7, 8, 9, 10. Now compare that to the Roman numeral system being used near to this time. No 0, so it goes to Roman numeral I, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And what we use today, what is the Arabic system, derived from the Arabs. They had 0, but come along a little bit later. 1, 2. The Arabic system's a lot easier system to work with than the Roman system. Plus you have 0 in it. So the Mayans had a system of hieroglyphics, but they never developed a written alphabet like what we have. There's evidence of a series of civil wars and environmental disasters led to the decline in the 10th century. Apparently we're working in very fragile ecosystems of the rainforests. There's some evidence of malnutrition from skeletal remains. So after their collapse, they just they never really recovered from those early disasters. Now the Aztecs built a huge empire in central Mexico, based from their capital Tenochtitlan. Founded around 1325. That is modern-day Mexico City. There they gradually extended their control of central Mexico. According to the legend, they set out to find a site for their great capital, and their leader was given a vision from the gods saying, "We see the sign of the eagle on the cactus eating a serpent. That is where you build it." So they went high and low, and finally, this little isle in the middle of this lake, the crater of this extinct volcano, they found that sign: eagle on the cactus eating a snake. And that is the symbol for the Mexican flag. That's that symbol you're seeing. You never see that flag. It's Aztec. built this huge city here, little narrow land bridges up to the coast, but basically they kind of row back and forth their canoes. Incredibly advanced city for the time. Stone buildings, palaces, temples. In fact, even to this day, they're still finding all sorts of artifacts in the Aztecs. They'll stop highway construction projects and building projects. So they found some ancient Aztec temple somewhere, and the archaeologists come in and sift through it. Then a series of tribes in the region, loosely held under the Aztecs, are forced to trade with them, pay tribute, and also provide subjects for human sacrifice, because they believe that their sun god need to be fed human hearts so he can complete his trek across the sky each day. About 1519, just before the arrival of the Spanish, I believe the Aztec Empire had a population of about 5 million people. Then you've got the Incan civilization. The Incas built this civilization perched in the high in the Andes Mountains. They had cities on mountaintops and a road system connected for 1,000 miles up along the Pacific coast of South America, connecting all these cities. Very advanced, very prosperous society. But this would be the last of the major Mesoamerican civilizations to fall to the Spanish. It took them more than 20 years to be conquered. Now, by about 1500, across the Americas, it's estimated there's a population of about 50 million people. About 4 million in the continental United States. Once the Europeans arrived, these numbers are going to drop dramatically for a variety of reasons. We'll go with those as we go on. But you had overall a prosperous and thriving series of tribes and communities and civilizations across the entire continent. Now, the first of the Europeans to arrive was Leif Erikson. Story behind that in the Vikings. The 8th, 9th, 10th centuries, Vikings struck terror into the peoples all across Europe. A warrior society of adventurers, explorers. They'd raid and pillage, take whatever they wanted to. Entire kingdoms offered them huge amounts of tribute every year just to be left in peace. But so here it is. So this is England, Scotland, Ireland. We'll say for because obviously not to scale. This is Europe. Now the Vikings primarily centered here in Sweden and Norway. The Norwegian Vikings, they'd be moving outward here along the coast. Occasionally they'd be raiding England. And in 870, they end up conquering Iceland from the Irish. They call it Iceland because of the number of glaciers in there. But explorers, they decided to go a little bit further. A little bit further out, Greenland. That's what it is. Greenland was colonized from the west coast here by a man named Eric the Red back in 985. So colonies, sometimes they did all right for a long time, some didn't. These initial colonies ended up failing by the 15th century. No one exactly sure why it did. But anyway, this huge trade route going back from Greenland, Iceland, back to Scandinavia. Actually, the distances sailing really aren't that far. Again, this is not to scale. Iceland's a lot closer to Greenland than it is to England or Norway. So one day, this trader is trying to hit western Greenland, misses, ends up going a little bit further west. A couple more 100 miles further west, you get a huge series of islands, which is eastern Canada. In this case, Baffin Island, Canada. Decided he didn't explore it, but turned around and told people what he saw. That inspired Eric's son, Leif Erikson, to explore a little bit further. So in the year 1001, from Norway to Iceland, Greenland to Canada. Name was called Baffin Island today, Helluland. Sailed along the eastern coast of Canada, Labrador, we call it today the English name. They call it Markland. And finally to Newfoundland. And that's the English name, which he called Finland. He saw some winters there in 1001. Unfortunately, though, the Native American inhabitants of Newfoundland didn't know who the Vikings were, didn't know what their reputation was back in Europe, and they really didn't care. All they saw was this group of invaders coming in and started fighting with them. Erikson's killed in one of these raids. In by springtime, the Vikings left Finland, or Newfoundland, sailed back, told what they found. What the Vikings did was kept on sending out a series of settlers for the next 15 years trying to colonize Newfoundland. Just trying to colonize Canada. But had the same results that Erikson's initial party in 1001 did, and were never able to make any kind of colony successful in the region. In about 1016, they'd pretty much given up all their other efforts. Now, there were other stories of indications there might have been some groups might have encountered America before other groups encountered America before Columbus did. 1491, the Chinese sponsored an expedition, one explorer sailing along the western coast of North America, but the Chinese didn't stay, just really didn't find anything too interesting, and went home again. Also some indications of some contact between some of the tribes of South America and Western Africa. We go way far south here. We'll pretend this is Africa. It's not too far here between the coast of South America and Western Africa. There's some artifacts and some indications, cultural ideas that indicate there might have been some contact between the two, maybe sometime around the 11th, 12th, or 13th centuries. Because around that time, a lot of these communities and cultures in Western Africa had fairly advanced trading contacts and throughout the region. Several built very advanced and prosperous empires based on trade.
Back up to the portion where you were talking about the colonization, where they were sending people for over a 15-year period trying to colonize. Was there a reason for leaving the area to try to colonize for the same as the other Europeans, as far as religious belief, religious persecution, stuff like that, or just in fact just for obtaining land and what?
Yeah, basically, in this case, it was for obtaining land.
Yeah, the Vikings are very materialistic.
Like I say, they did have a religious system, though, was that most of them weren't quite Christian yet.
Okay.
Yeah, it was
I
mainly
can imagine it was.
it was mainly based on fighting.
Conquer-
They died.
Colonization,
Valhalla.
fighting, adventure, go to war for humanity, that kind of thing. So basically, it's just one, it's there. Two, some good farmland there.
Hey,
To start building and see what you can do with it. Well, whatever early contacts there were between the Eastern Hemisphere and the Western Hemisphere, they apparently did not last too long. The Vikings abandoned their efforts. Whatever contact was between Africa and South America disappeared fairly quickly. Also, some indications may have been some ships that have blown off course in Europe and ended up in the Americas, but we're not exactly sure. No hard and fast evidence, just hints of it. But anything from Europe to the Americas before this, nobody ever came back. They might have been stranded there. Who knows? But just hints of it. The archaeological studies are inconclusive at this point. But Europe in the 15th century, you have an age of great change. 1453, Constantinople fell to the Ottoman Turks, giving the Turks controlling the established land routes to India and China. All the silk, spices, technology unknown to Europe, such as gunpowder, movable type of printing, the luxuries that Europe craved. Europe was trading with India and China this time, but with the fall of Constantinople, it meant that the Muslims now in charge of all these different land routes. And Europe were unwilling to trade with them. Now, the Turks would trade with them, but it's going to cost you something. Well, the Italians tried to take over some of these sea routes and land routes that the Byzantine Empire had out of Constantinople, but go further west into Western Europe, the Spanish, the French, the English, the Dutch, and others, they were unwilling to go through a middleman yet again. And they cut into their profits, drove up their costs, thinking, why can't we just do this ourselves? Why can't we just go directly to China or India? Well, several things are making that possible. Classical Greco-Roman knowledge slowly returning to Western Europe, which allowed such things as improved map making and navigation techniques. Just making interest in sailing outside the Mediterranean a lot more plausible. Try to finish our map of Europe here. Now, the Mediterranean Sea, anyway, Mediterranean Sea sailed for thousands of years. Everybody knew where everything was. Everybody knew the dangers. Everybody look at it. No matter where you sail in the Mediterranean, you're going to end up hitting land at some point or coming very close to it. So it's hard to get lost, hard to get to. So you're not going to sail off in the empty ocean forever. So people generally tend to stay close to the Mediterranean or very close to the coast. Safer, close to land. It's generally a entirely different type of sailing which you have way up here in the deep oceans. Well, in Portugal, we have a man named Prince Henry the Navigator comes along. And he has this idea of making Portugal a great naval power. What he does is open a school of navigation in the early 15th century, basically trying to teach people these new, old Greek navigation and map-making techniques to basically teach them to be better sailors. Not just for the civilian merchant fleet, but also for the military as well. We're going to have a lot of merchants sailing back and forth. They're going to need protection. Plus, you're right there on the coast. You're going to need the protection for anybody who might be sailing in trying to attack you. So you need that. But also, as you're trying to encourage more people to sail and trade, they need to know what they're doing. So Henry's trying to encourage this new knowledge, this new exploration. Well, from Portugal, they end up sailing along the coast of Africa, but it's a long, long coastline along Africa. Africa's a huge continent. And eventually they end up venturing around the Horn of Africa, but not able to reach India by sailing along the coast and going down Africa and back up here to India. That'll do that till 1498 with the voyage of Vasco da Gama. As this new mathematical knowledge, we're able to calculate the size of the world fairly accurately. Now, European scholars knew the world was round. No one had ever really seriously taken seriously the idea the Earth was flat. So when Columbus comes along, he's not trying to prove the world is round. They know it is. What they're trying to prove is that it's technologically possible to sail around the world. They know that on a sphere, you sail far enough west, you're going to head east at some point. Basic geometry. But when most of your ships are used to sailing right on the coast, voyages several thousand miles out into the deep ocean, that's asking a lot. That's pushing the absolute limits of 15th century naval technology. Now, Spain, 1492, Spain is just coming into existence. Several different kingdoms, particularly Castile and Aragon, are uniting to become one larger kingdom. Ferdinand of Aragon had married Isabella of Castile. And they're both very competent, intelligent, ambitious rulers. They realize that united, their two kingdoms become one of the great powers of Europe. In 1492, they took Granada in far south of Spain. It was the last Moorish stronghold in Spain. It was the last one held by the Muslims. And they're using the Roman Catholic Church to cement their control. That is, believing that people united by one religion and one religion alone is the Roman Catholic Church. That would solidify the people's ideology and faith, and therefore there could be, and with the church backing up the throne that is basically saying Ferdinand and Isabella are a king and queen by the virtue of God. So therefore, if you believed the church, you had to believe that Ferdinand and Isabella are your kings by the will of God. If you believe anything else is blasphemy. Yeah. So what they're trying to do is trying to create what they call in their words a most Catholic state. It is a state where it's not enough just to be 100% Catholic, you got to be 110%. They expelled the Muslims, they expelled the Jews, anybody who had any type of difference of opinion. That's they brought in the Spanish Inquisition. that is a church court under the authority of the control of monarchy. They would bring them in and torture you if they believed you were any kind of dissident, particularly religious dissident, trying to coerce a confession from you. So not exactly a good human rights record, shall we say. Well, along comes Christopher Columbus.
My man.
We don't know a lot about the early life of Christopher Columbus. Some indications he may have done a lot of piracy on the high seas of the Mediterranean, particularly against Spanish shipping. But who exactly he was, I'm not exactly sure. We know he was Italian. And he has this great idea of tapping into the wealth of the trade of the Far East, China, Indians, and so forth, by bypassing all these other land routes and routes around on the coast of Africa and just going directly west. Sail west, or basically kind of a west-southwesterly direction, you will hit the Far East. So he brings this proposal to Ferdinand and Isabella, asking them to finance this venture and supply ships. They were really very hesitant and initially turned him down. Right, that's a lot of money they're putting up. It's basically it's the equivalent of somebody going to the White House, knocking on the front door and asking President Obama to borrow an aircraft carrier. Would you? Of course they would say no. They know who this guy is. So Columbus tries again, goes to Portugal, goes to France, goes to England, meets with the crowns of these different states, but they're also skeptical. But Spanish have spies in the different courts, and they send word back to Madrid that this guy Columbus is talking to a lot of people, and there's some people interested in what he's saying. Start thinking Spain starts thinking maybe we should talk to this guy. Maybe we should finance his voyage before somebody else does. So they recall Columbus and tell him, okay, we'll give you 3 ships, the Nina, the Pinta, the Santa Maria. Gets his money and is allowed to sail west under a Spanish flag, and he reaches the New World on October 12, 1492. Columbus sailed the ocean blue, discovered America in 1492. Oh, wow. Well, the first island he discovers is an island of the Bahamas he calls San Salvador. Discovered some friendly natives, sailed on, still looking for the Indies. Sailed further south towards Cuba, then the Hispaniola, which is the modern-day nations of Haiti and the Dominican Republic. Found sizable amounts of gold jewelry, the first one to become core voyages. We left some men behind on Hispaniola and returned to Spain, reporting what he'd found. Again, just to emphasize how dangerous this voyage was, he goes to 3 ships, one of them sank along the way. So very easily, this might not have worked at all. But the 2 remaining ships make it back to Spain. They report they found natives, gold, what they think are the outskirts of Asia. So Columbus made these calculations and wasn't quite sure that what they calculations were off a little bit. Interestingly enough, on his expedition, Columbus had actually taken maps of these far northern islands that the Vikings had been circulating for a long time. The Vikings had stories circulating throughout ports right here for these strange lands in the far north that they had tried to settle long before. But Columbus thinks he's reached Asia, but until later realized he hasn't. He reports his findings back to the Spanish authorities. In 1493, given a commission as an admiral leading a fleet of 17 ships, he returns with orders to treat the natives affectionately. There was a problem, though. The men he'd gathered for this expedition had run wild, raping and pillaging the locals, trying to squeeze whatever kind of gold and valuables they can out of them. The natives responded, rose up, killed 10 of the Spaniards. Columbus saw what had happened, and he and his furious countrymen captured 500 in response, sold them back on the slave markets back in Europe. So 1493, the transatlantic slave trade begins. This time west going back east. On his further expeditions, Columbus sails along the coast of Central America, discovers other islands such as Puerto Rico by 1502. And all these territories are under Spanish control, but they can never figure out why they can't find Asia. And they don't know why. Where'd it go? And for years, they're mapping this out. They've literally miles and miles of maps. They're looking at the coastlines here, and figure out why isn't this Asian. Columbus dies in poverty and disgrace because of what's going on here. But the Spanish are moving to try to further cement their control of the region. Later it comes down to this man named Amerigo Vespucci. Again, like Columbus, he's an Italian, also from the city of Florence. 1499, other voyages, he'd explored he'd come to the Americas, exploring the New World, carefully mapping out the coastlines as he went along. Discovered a great landmass he also believed to be East Asia. But it wasn't until years later that, long after Vespucci, long after Columbus, that Spanish cartographers are studying these maps and realize the reason why they haven't found Asia yet is because this isn't Asia. It's an entirely new, different continental system. And so it was named America, or Amerigo Vespucci. We're getting North and South America. So really, you have to think about it. We dodged a bullet on that one. We committed the United States of Vespuccia, or Vespucci land, or even Colombia. Doesn't have the same ring to it. Well, as the Spanish arrive in the New World, this great cultural exchange takes place. The Native Americans saw horses, cattle, and gunpowder for the first time ever, and it dramatically altered civilization throughout the Americas. Some of these tribes in the plains, their culture became almost indistinguishable from its use of the horse, became such an important part of it. But it wasn't until the late 1600s, even the 1700s, some of these tribes in the Great Plains even encountered horses. And they became such great horsemen that quickly. The Europeans saw strange new creatures and imported new crops to Europe, such as potatoes, succotash, tobacco, pecans. By the end of the 16th century, American corn and sweet potatoes were staple crops in China. Tobacco, the great European tradition of chain smoking, began. But it's extremely valuable crops, extremely valuable trade, and it's altering the economy and the cultures of both sides. But there's also another problem: disease. New diseases Native Americans encountered for the first time ever decimated, particularly such diseases as typhus and measles, and worst of all, smallpox. Now, because of vaccination today, smallpox doesn't even exist. The last reported case was in 1971. But at its height, smallpox killed millions. Typhus and measles were devastating diseases, killed thousands of people in the United States into the 20th century before they had vaccines. But today it's almost completely unheard of. Well, the natives never encountered any similar disease before, and they had absolutely no immunity against it. It's estimated that 1/3 of the population of central Mexico was killed by smallpox in 10 years of the Spanish arrival. Now, I understand the Europeans didn't quite know why this was happening. All they knew was there's some kind of connection with their presence and these diseases. They had no way of treating it. The germ theory of disease is still centuries away. And for the Europeans, they're a little past the idea that demonic possession is causing disease in their own medical science. They really had no idea why this was happening. But other explorers would come and go. Ferdinand Magellan, for example, he sailed around the world in a 3-year expedition between 1519 and 1522. Magellan made about 2/3 of the way across, dying in small islands of the Pacific Ocean. So there's men that did discover came across Asia. About 2/3 of Magellan's men would die on this expedition. They barely made it back. But as first officer, continued the mission, eventually making their way back to Spain, and the mission was dedicated to his memory. So even though Magellan didn't quite make it all the way through, it was his plan, his leadership that got him that far, and so he's generally given the credit for it, even though he died most of the way across. Portugal founded a colony in Brazil in the 16th century. The cities of Sao Paulo founded by 1554 and Rio de Janeiro by 1567. But as the Spanish arrived, though, they're impressed by the wealth of resources available: gold, jewelry, silver, great natural resources, agricultural resources. So the Spanish are excited because they get rich. They basically won the lottery here. So Spain's whole mission here in the New World in the next couple of centuries can be squeeze every dime they can out of the Americas. So take what gold and silver they can find from the tribes, bring that back to Spain. Their soldiers, the conquistadors, it's a translation for conqueror. They were there to try to make as much fame, make as much money, become as famous as they could, basically. Or what my history professors described as the 3 Gs: gold, God, and glory. But not necessarily in that that order. One Spanish soldier summed up their purpose in the New World saying, quote, "We came here to serve God and the King, and also get rich." No gray area there. But here's the great tragedy of the Spanish in the New World. They made literally billions of dollars in gold and silver mining. Billions of dollars. And by the end of the 1600s, they were completely bankrupt. They spent every dime of it. And just like some of the lottery winners here, just go crazy with money, think there was a never-ending supply of it, but they didn't manage it right and blew through every bit of it. Or Spain is poised to become one of the great powers of Europe. Yeah, really only a minor power in Europe today. They never really got past that. But that is our tale of Mexico and Spain today, the Americas. Continue reading chapters 1 and go on to chapter 2 for Wednesday. Are there any questions? If not, see y'all.
Might want to stop the recording.